Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Read, Write, Own by Chris Dixon. I'll talk very briefly about the author and go into an overview of what the book is about. Talk about what I liked about the book, what I didn't like about the book, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Chris Dixon is a venture capital guy, best known for his work with Andreessen Horowitz, which is a big Silicon Valley VC firm. He was an early investor in Bitcoin, and he is an evangelist for the blockchain technology, which is what most of this book is about. He talks about how he thinks that it has taken a backseat to other technologies like augmented reality, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence. And he goes through in the book through a history of the internet, really roughly from the protocol networks up to Web 2.0 and into today, and how he feels that there has been an entrenchment with corporate power in terms of social networks and other benefits of the internet that have accrued away from creators to owners of these large corporations. And he feels that blockchain is a way to remediate that issue. One of the things that I liked about the book, he has a section called the Attract Extract Cycle, which is about how corporations, when they're starting out, especially like Uber is probably a great example of this. I'll leave my link below to the video I did on Super Pumped if you want to check that out there. But they give a lot of incentives to people to come into the market as they're trying to build market share. So they're trying to incentivize drivers and riders to use the product. And then when it gets to a certain point, they begin squeezing the riders and squeezing the drivers, and it becomes less and less attractive. And as the business becomes less and less attractive, more VC money goes elsewhere and kind of repeats the cycle. So I think he did a very good job of explaining how that works. The book goes into pretty painstaking details as how blockchain works. So if you ever really wanted to understand on a deep level, I've read now 2 books on blockchain. I still find it quite confusing, but if you wanted to know the ins and outs of it, how it works, the book does a good job of walking you through that. The downsides of the book, and I will say he does go into a pretty long section towards the very, very end of the book. It's not as long as I would have liked, but there is a part of the book where he talks about some practical applications of blockchain, and one of them is the ability for blockchain to serve as an authenticator for deepfakes. So using that to fight deepfake technology, which I thought was interesting. And he thinks kind of the rise of artificial intelligence is kind of a dangerous thing. I don't know if he uses specifically those words, but he sees that as a tool that probably will be used against creators. And there's something he calls one-boxing, which is where search engines basically give a one-box description of a site. So the person who is using the user doesn't actually have to click into the site to see the information. And so that deprives revenue resources from potentially that site owner. And he goes into basically his beefs with the big tech companies. And one of the big ones is he feels that it's very, very difficult to switch from a tech firm. You basically have to agree with the rules that they have set forth. And if you don't agree with the rules, it's very difficult for you to switch because there are so few options. And he feels this is kind of a draconian way for them to do things. And you really have to agree with the platform. He really doesn't like the idea of deplatforming. He mentions that a couple times. And so in general, I would say Chris Dixon has a pretty negative view of the current ecosystem for I would say the FANGs especially, so Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. He has a kind of a feeling of dismissal towards them and has a low opinion of them. And he sees that blockchain is a possible balance to some of these things. And through the blockchain technology, he believes that people will begin to create their own networks through the blockchain and provide a lot of the services we see currently today with the big tech, essentially. The problem I had with the book is I do think that it's very utopian, and I was waiting and waiting and patiently waiting and waiting some more for him to give me like a practical application of how someone like me, who is not on the bleeding edge of technology, would want to use this thing. He has a long section about creators and how he sees this as a boon for creators if they are able to essentially take the size and scope of the platforms and somehow, some way, get those same users to come over to blockchain. And if the revenues remain the same, then there's going to be much more egalitarian system to where, because what he calls the take rates are much lower with the blockchain technology, that there's less corporate concentration of power and the revenue will be much, much less concentrated, and basically creators will get much more of that slice of the pie. He never really does, in my opinion, a good job of explaining how that crossover is going to happen. He doesn't really do a very good job of explaining to me why a user who's used to the ease and simplicity of, like, say, for instance, the YouTube interface would move to a blockchain. I don't see the benefit of them doing that, and I don't think he does a very good job of explaining that, how that would work. And so the benefit to me of the things like YouTube and Facebook, certainly there's a corporate concentration of power, and certainly there are creators who probably feel that they've been cheated, but there are still success stories within that ecosystem of people making money. There's, I think, a widely agreed upon, based on consumers moving and using these platforms, that they do essentially what the customers want them to do, which is provide free entertainment to them, and are really relatively easy to use. There's a couple times where he talks about calls the content in some of these instances broad and shallow, and he sees if you have a blockchain system, and he never really talks about how you would do this as far as aggregating the blockchain to where it's a much more diverse content pool, but he basically says, YouTube, the content's really broad and shallow. And I was like, I've been able to, in the last few weeks, look up probably countless number of videos on, distributive justice and moral philosophers. I've been able to watch videos from Michael Sandel and Alistair McIntyre, people talking about him and talking about Rawls and Nozick and Pete Singer, and Bentham and Mill. And so to me, it was like, I don't know what he's necessarily talking about. And he certainly, it's possible if you, again, live in this utopian world where the revenues are moved over to this utopian system, that maybe there'd be more professional creators, and maybe that would provide more depth of material. But I don't know if that's a real criticism of the network. I don't know how many people that really bothers. So it was hard for me the whole time I was sitting there going, what problem does the blockchain actually solve? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And he has a long section on NFTs and how he sees that NFTs are going to be a possible creation where creators can use blockchains to create NFTs that can be kind of moved from game to game. So if someone creates a game in, like, Diablo 1, for instance, they can move that sword or whatever. If there is a game a la Diablo 1 and someone has a sword in Diablo 1, using an NFT, the example he gives is you would be able to move that sword from Diablo, the equivalent of Diablo 1 to 2 to 3 to whatever. You basically could keep moving this game to game through NFTs. He distinguishes the casino idea of blockchain versus the computer idea of blockchain, being like, the casino is the FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, bad. He doesn't believe in currency being the main driver of the blockchain technology. He feels that that's kind of damaged the brand of blockchain. But then he doesn't really give you any success stories where blockchain has been used to solve actual problems for actual people. And so that is kind of the rub. And the whole problem I had with it was just like, the whole time he just sounds like someone who's looking forward into the future and sees all these great things, but then doesn't really talk about why we haven't received them yet. And there are times where he says, well, the government is kind of iffy on tokens, whether or not they're commodities and whether or not they're futures or securities. And to me, it was like, well, they figured it out with the trading, so I don't know why they can't figure it out this other way. And so I don't know how much of an obstacle this is really legally. To me, the onus was on Dixon to tell me, like, a working case of, like, why this would benefit me. Given that, like, most people seem to have a relatively low knowledge of how technology works, when I hear him talk about blockchain, it seems like it requires a lot of democracy. It requires a lot of people voting and having a say in the game and skin in the game. And the benefit of the corporate model, you may see it as a benefit, you may not see it as a benefit, is I don't really need to worry about how they're handling the company. I just want to, like, upload my stupid videos every week, And so I don't know how many people would want to be permanent creators, given the givens of everything, of the requirement of having, like, the requirement of doing the work, as it were. And I don't know, like, what that would look like. He at one point estimates, well, you'd have like 2 million more jobs if you took, like, YouTube, for instance, and applied the same take rates that, like, Ethereum uses to YouTube. You'd have, like, I don't know what the equivalent would be, $120 billion. He says basically 2 million more jobs in the US, which would be 1%, which would be cool. And YouTube is a global platform, so presumably you'd have to split that among the other creators around the world. So it wouldn't quite be 2 million jobs in the US, but it seemed like a really, really, really long run for a really short slide. And that piece of how you get current users of these platforms to switch to like a blockchain when the technology feels really opaque to a lot of people, that was never, that hurdle never was clear to me. And why someone would create games with blockchain instead of games in the plethora of other systems that you can use was never quite clear to me. And he has a section in the book about the music industry, and he says, well, the reason the music industry failed and the video game industry didn't fail is because music didn't turn into adapt to the technological change, and video games did. And that to me was like such a partial telling of the story. The reason that music failed was certainly part of it, that they ignored the technological ramifications of what was going on. The other part of it is that this was at a time when T1 modems, were just coming into effect. T1 and T3 modems were just becoming popular, and so it was relatively easy to download like a 3 megabyte file, as opposed to, I don't know how large like Metal Gear Solid 1 or 2 would have been, but it would have been gigabytes of files. And so there is a difference of someone wanting to download like a 3 megabyte file versus like a 4 gigabyte file. The space on your computer just simply wasn't large enough for you to do that. And there's also the homogenization of music, of mainstream music, that happened during that time due to corporate consolidation. And so it wasn't that, he seems to try to make it a very simple story to basically say, the reason video games are so huge is because they leaned into the technology. And it's like, well, they had the ability to lean into the technology because there was only 3 or 4 platforms where you could play them. And there wasn't an infrastructure where people were basically finding ways to get pirated MP3 files to like consumers. And so to me, it was like not really the full story. What I would have liked from the book, and I didn't get from the book, and I've read, this is the second book on this that I've read. I've also read The Cryptopians, I believe is that book, which is about Ethereum, which is quite good, and I recommend people reading that. I would actually probably recommend you starting there before going to this, because this to me is kind of like an evangelist trying to sell you on a product without really telling you that, like, well, this is how it would benefit you specifically as someone who is a user, a watcher of YouTube, but not necessarily a creator of YouTube. And I was just waiting for, at least in Cryptopians, there's at least like this idea that, well, you could use a blockchain if you wanted to recreate Uber. Well, you could technically have this technology that we all agree to, and we're all basically independent contractors, but we pool our resources in order to do this, in order to drive. And instead of the platform taking half the cut, maybe it takes 5% of the cut or something. And so there's a much larger pool of money to drivers than there would be, but you'd have to get that to scale for it to really make sense. And who's going to watch it? It's kind of like this idea of is it a leaderless society? Like, what are the basic rules? Who decides those basic rules? How do you distribute tokens at the beginning? And so all those things have to be worked out that are kind of different from a normal, typical corporate structure. And he doesn't really, I don't think he really understands or appreciates the difficulty in that. And I was surprised that he doesn't ever come to the conclusion and says, this has been 16 years that this technology has been here, at least in theory. And the iPhone has been around since I think 2007 or 2008, and Uber happened the year after that, or maybe it was 2 years. But the point is, like, there seems to be much longer window of time for this computer model of blockchain to have occurred, and all these things could have been created, and they haven't been created. And well, why is that, Chris? And he doesn't really, in my opinion, come with a full understanding and acceptance of why it hasn't happened. And I don't know why that is, but I found it to be quite frustrating. So I don't really have an answer. I don't really have an answer or understanding of why the book was that way. I don't know what the confusion was. I don't know why it seems to be trying to sell you something for the whole book. But it felt basically like someone trying to sell me something for the entirety of the book, and I don't know why that was, and I found that to be frustrating. So I don't really think if there's anything else. He does mention, so the other thing is, like, again, going back to like what problem does this actually solve? At one point he mentions a pretty famous article from Wire basically talking about 1,000 fans. You need 1,000 super fans as a creator to make a living. And he says that hasn't really happened. But Patreon is essentially that. If you have 1,000 people who will buy anything that you have and subscribe to you, and you charge them $40 a year, 40 times 1,000 is 40,000. And so you really don't need that many people. One of my favorite podcasts, Dungeons and Daddies, that's essentially what they do. If you want all the content we make, here it is. It's 40, 50, $60 for the year. and they have hundreds of thousands of people who are subscribed to them. So like it can be done. It's just a matter of how do you look at this and how do you get the distribution model in front of people. And there wasn't really anything. He talks about how expensive marketing is and how blockchains don't market, but then is FTX part of the blockchain? It's like, is this excluded? Are these like, because there's been plenty of advertising of FTX and other exchanges. And so to make that distinction and say the casino side advertises, but we don't advertise on the computer side, it seemed like a little bit of splitting of hairs. And I wish that he had come with, if you're not going to give me like a real life example of something working, if you're going to lean on NFTs can like change video games, and video games are such a huge market, but then not mention the Bored Ape and how Bored Ape has dropped. And so the whole thing was like, I was at least hoping for you to give me at least like a vision of your future of how this could benefit the average person. And he does say, there are times where, financial costs are so high that he says at one point, the ability to send money should be like sending a text, and remittance costs are so high for people who are trying to send money to other countries. Again, that's true. That's a thing that is true. I don't know how much that's going to change my life or anybody else's life drastically if you're going to try to put it up there with AI. It's really easy for me to envision a world where the price of pharmaceuticals dropped 25% because we found a way to shorten the time it takes to determine dead ends of pharmaceutical research. And we are able to highlight or bright side, identify, highlight the best chances of pharmaceuticals for this, and this factor. I can see that through AI very easily. I can see the use of autonomous drivers and the benefit of that in reducing fatalities on the road. And I can see that in terms of space exploration, of determining where the most likely asteroids that would be easy or relatively easy to mine. I can see the benefit of that too. What I'm trying to understand is what is the benefit of blockchain? And he says, well, this amazing technology can do all these things. But then like when you get into the real application, if at the end of the day, all it can do is basically, if there is a world where someone creates a website that's better than Facebook and is able to attract 2 billion people to it, that's based upon blockchain technology, and he's able to get all these creators to come to it, and it's amazing, this great thing, then why haven't they done it yet? And I was waiting for a long time for why haven't they done it yet? And it just never got here. And he talks about protocol networks, and I thought that was interesting because I hadn't really thought of that in terms of how these things are so kind of pre-Web 2.0 that they're kind of just like water and air, and people just assume that they're more open, based on open source, and there's not as much tinkering. But he really has a hard time, and it to him feels very personal when he's talking about being deplatformed or having rules that you don't agree with. People would say, well, you have obscenity rules for the reason if you're going to have children on there that you need obscenity rules and pornography rules in order to protect children from seeing these things. And how do you do that if you have how do you do that with a blockchain and retain scale, and should you do that? And so there's all kinds of murky stuff with it. And I was wishing, if, like I said, he gave like at least a test case or his vision of what this could look like, just like a fake dummy test case. I would have appreciated the book a lot more. At the end of it, it just felt like small ball, and it felt like, okay, they're going to be NFTs, and so the video games, you'll be able to do this, and this. And it just didn't really seem inspiring to me, given the scale that we're looking at and the ability for other things to really radically change things. It just felt like small ball. Maybe it's just something I'm not seeing, and maybe I'm missing the point, and maybe there's a test case that someone else could put together that's imagine a world where this thing happens. But I was just like waiting for it to be like, okay, this changes everything, and it just doesn't. Even by its own numbers, you're talking about, the video game industry is very large. It's like $150 billion, but it's relatively small compared to everything. And I'm still irked about the music video game. I think that was just a false comparison of comparing those two things, because they're very, very different experiences for people. But I would check this book out if you're interested in crypto. But I would check out Cryptopians more. I think the book to me was not super successful. His writing is a little clunky at times, and for such a short book, it felt like a long time to get through it. I wish he had kind of cut down or whittled down some of the stuff about how blockchain works, because you have to get to that. You have to get through all that to really get to the practical applications of the technology, which is really pretty far into the book. And I really wish he had maybe cut out some of this, like, here's the history of the internet, here's the history of blockchain, this is what it does, there's this is the building blocks of it. And you're just like, I don't know if I need that. And that was the other part. It's like, who is the audience for this book? Is it for creators of YouTube and Twitter? Is it for venture capitalist people? Because I don't know if either one of those groups are going to be convinced. I surely don't think if it's just users of these platforms that they're going to be like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And that was the other part. It's like, I didn't understand what the benefit, why you would choose to move. It wasn't clear to me. Read Right On, Chris Dixon. Next time I'm going to be reading Luna New Moon by Ian McDonald. It looks like a pretty fun sci-fi novel. Please, if you've enjoyed this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll leave the link below to the video on Cryptopians. Until next time.